The soft hum of the street lamp outside barely reached the dimly lit study. Emily, wrapped in an old cardigan, rubbed her hands together to ward off the evening chill. The quiet of the night was unsettling, a silence that amplified her loneliness. She scanned the cluttered shelves, muttering to herself. "I should have done this months ago," she whispered, pulling out dusty books one by one. Her hand brushed against something unusual. Smooth, metallic. She hesitated before tugging at it, revealing a small, locked box nestled between two thick novels. "What's this?" she murmured, her brows knitting together. It wasn't like David to leave things out of place. His meticulous nature didn't match the haphazard hiding spot. Seconds later, his apartment vanished and everything in its place, making her spot search the water tube for hours. Curiosity ignited in her. The box was heavier than it looked, the lock rusted but not impenetrable. Emily's hands hovered over the lock as she debated whether to proceed. A voice in her head whispered warnings. "You're overthinking, put it back." But another part, louder and more insistent, urged her forward. She found a small screwdriver in David's desk drawer and pried the lock open. A click echoed in the still room, making her flinch. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid, revealing a leather-bound diary. Her eyes moved from the diary itself to the words, and "This doesn't belong here," she said aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The diary's worn cover contrasted starkly with the pristine order of their home. The edges of its pages were frayed, as though it had been handled far more than the books surrounding it. The scent of old paper filled the room as Emily opened the diary. Her eyes skimmed the first page, expecting mundane notes or work details. Instead, a name she didn't recognize jumped out. Sarah. Her heart sank. She turned the pages, skimming through entries that were vague, yet deeply personal. Like the others, the scrapbook contained only a few notes. "Met Sarah again today," one line read. "She's beginning to trust me more. That's good. It makes everything easier." Her stomach twisted. Who was Sarah? And what was David doing that required someone's trust? She flipped through the pages faster, the weight of each word pressing heavier on her chest. The entries felt cold, calculated. Emily reached an entry near the back of the diary. Her breath caught in her throat as she read. End of chapter 22. She threatened to tell. I couldn't let her ruin everything. I had to make her disappear. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. Her hands trembled, the diary almost slipping from her grasp. The page detailed how David had silenced Sarah. Manipulation, control, it was all laid out in haunting clarity. She shouldn't have pushed me. I didn't want to hurt her, but she left me no choice. It's done now, and nobody will find her. Emily's mind raced. Who was this man she had married? The loving husband she thought she knew had penned these chilling words? Her thoughts snapped to her best friend, Lila, who had always been wary of David. Mastered the skills of wisdom, an experienced judge, David mastered the skills needed for teaching and supporting men. "Oh my God," she whispered, clutching the diary to her chest. A faint sound broke through her shock. A car door slamming. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her ears. She scrambled to close the diary and shove it back into the box. It was a concept, not a phenomenon reaching this far north, and something she wasn't ready to accept. The lock wouldn't latch. Her fingers fumbled as the adrenaline surged through her. She shoved the box back onto the shelf, covering it with books, just as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. The front door creaked open, its familiar groan sending a shiver down her spine. "Emily?" David's voice carried through the house, casual, yet heavy with presence. She grabbed a stack of papers and pretended to be sorting them. Her hands shook as she forced a smile when he walked in. "You're home early," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to appear calm. David raised an eyebrow, setting his briefcase down on the chair. "Couldn't sleep at the office. Thought I'd come back to you." He stepped closer, his piercing gaze scanning the room. "What are you doing up so late?" "Just organizing," Emily replied, her voice cracking slightly. David's eyes lingered on the shelf behind her before returning to meet hers. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I see," he said softly, his tone unreadable. "I see." Emily forced a laugh, but her racing heart betrayed her. "I was just about to head to bed." "Good idea," David said, leaning in to kiss her on the cheek. The touch felt colder than usual, sending a chill down her spine. As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "By the way," he said, his tone sharper now, "if you ever find something that doesn't belong to you, it's better not to touch it. You never know what you might uncover." Emily's blood ran cold, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. Her trembling footsteps echoed down the hall as she disappeared into their bedroom, leaving the study and the darkness within it behind her. The kitchen clock ticked loudly, each second accentuating the emptiness Emily felt. She stood by the window, gazing at the streetlights casting faint halos on the damp pavement. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, a silence that had become deafening. She placed her coffee cup on the counter, the clink echoing in the emptiness. David hadn't come home for dinner. Again. Emily sighed, pulling her cardigan tighter around her. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. They had started with laughter and whispered promises. Now, the spaces between them felt like canyons. The memory of David's warm smile, once a constant, had grown distant, replaced by curt nods and distracted glances. Conversations had devolved into monosyllables, leaving Emily to fill the void with questions that never received answers. Her chest tightened as she whispered, "What happened to us?" David's absence was becoming routine. He was home less and less, always armed with vague explanations. "I had a late meeting," he would mutter, not even glancing at her as he tossed his keys on the counter. "What kind of meeting runs until midnight?" Emily had asked once, her voice tinged with frustration. David's jaw tightened, and he finally looked at her, his eyes cold. "Work doesn't follow a 9-to-5 schedule, Emily. You know that." His words stung more than she cared to admit. Now, as Emily sat on the edge of their bed, the ache in her chest deepened. The scent of his cologne lingered faintly on his pillow, a reminder of how close, yet unreachable, he had become. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Emily met Lila at their usual cafe the next afternoon. The warmth of the coffee shop provided little comfort against the icy weight in Emily's heart. Lila leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "I'm telling you, something's off about him." Emily stirred her latte absent-mindedly. "You've never liked David," she muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's not about liking him," Lila shot back. "It's about the way he's treating you, the late nights, the excuses." "Emily, wake up. You deserve better than this." Emily swallowed hard, her eyes stinging. She wanted to defend David, to believe the man she married wasn't hiding something. But the doubt in her best friend's voice mirrored her own growing fears. That evening, Emily couldn't shake Lila's words. As she moved through their house, every misplaced item and strange detail seemed like a clue. Questions racked her mind, distracting her from. Her eyes fell on the study bookshelf. It had always been David's domain, his sanctuary of order. Yet a section of books looked slightly askew. She approached, her fingers grazing the spines until she found it. Behind the books sat a small, locked box. Emily's pulse quickened. Why would David hide something here? She shook the thought from her mind, but her hand lingered over the box. A quiet voice inside her whispered, "This could be the answer." The next day, Emily joined David at a work dinner, a rare invitation. David was the perfect host, laughing easily and charming his colleagues. Yet, as Emily watched him from across the table, unease crept in. There was something performative about his demeanor, like he was playing a role, a task left to a human to keep everyone safe. When their eyes met, his smile faltered. It was brief, but Emily caught it, a crack in his polished facade. "Are you okay?" she asked softly as they left the restaurant. David's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "Why wouldn't I be?" he replied, his voice too measured. Emily nodded, but the doubt in her chest grew heavier. As the days passed, Emily noticed more strange behaviors. David's phone buzzed incessantly with messages he never shared. One evening, she heard him speaking in hushed tones on a phone call. "I told you I'll handle it," he said sharply, before lowering his voice again. When he saw Emily in the doorway, his expression hardened. "Do you mind giving me some privacy?" Emily stepped back, but her stomach churned. The gap between them was widening, and she felt herself teetering on the edge of something dark. Emily couldn't sleep that night. The locked box weighed on her mind, a silent temptation she couldn't resist. She crept into the study, her heart pounding. Using a small screwdriver, she pried the lock open. The click echoed in the stillness, sending a shiver down her spine. She paused. Inside was a leather-bound diary. She opened it hesitantly, her hands trembling. The first entry was innocuous enough, a work meeting, some notes. But as she read further, the entries grew darker. Mentions of someone named Sarah appeared repeatedly, each more cryptic than the last. "Who is she?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. The words on the pages seemed to crawl off the paper, wrapping around her heart like a vice. The next morning, Emily called Lila. "You won't believe what I found," Emily said, her voice shaking. Lila hesitated. "Do you really want to go down this road? Once you start, there's no turning back." "I have to," Emily replied firmly. "I can't live like this anymore. I need to know the truth." Lila sighed. "Okay, I'm here for you. But be careful, Emily. This could get dangerous." For the next few days, Emily and David moved around each other like strangers. Every word, every glance felt loaded with unspoken tension. David's late nights continued, and Emily's obsession with the diary grew. Daily, she knew she was standing on the edge of something monumental. The truth was within reach, but so was the risk of everything falling apart. In the quiet of their home, the secrets between them felt louder than ever. The storm was coming. Emily could feel it, and she wasn't sure she would survive. Emily nodded before she answered. As the two came closer, she heard their heartbeats faintly, like the heartbeats of sleep, and she thought, "The storm will save." The clock struck midnight, and the house was wrapped in an oppressive stillness. Emily sat on the living room couch, the leather-bound diary resting on her lap. She stared at it, her fingers tracing its worn edges. Her breath hitched as she opened it, the pages releasing a faint scent of aged paper. The first few entries were mundane. Work schedules, notes on clients. But soon, the tone shifted. "Met Sarah again today," read one line. "She's starting to trust me. It's working." Emily's brow furrowed. Who was Sarah? The words felt heavy, ominous, The further she read, the more cryptic the entries became. She's vulnerable, perfect for the plan. A chill crawled up Emily's spine. The handwriting, so familiar, now felt alien. David's thoughts, so cold, calculated, were etched into the pages, revealing a side of him she had never known. Emily flipped the pages, her heartbeat quickening. The name Sarah appeared again and again. One entry, dated 6 months ago, stopped her cold. She's everything Emily isn't. Exciting, vibrant, free. I can't let her go. Her hands trembled as tears pricked her eyes. The words carved into her heart, each one a betrayal. She works with him, Emily whispered, realization dawning. She remembered Sarah, a bubbly young assistant at David's firm. The woman had suddenly left her position months ago, with no explanation. Her mind swirled. Why hadn't she seen this coming? How could David, her husband, have done this? As Emily continued reading, a horrifying pattern emerged. David had isolated Sarah, cutting her off from her family and friends. "She's mine now," one entry read. "I've made sure she has no one else to turn to." Emily's stomach turned. The words were devoid of affection, only power. David had used Sarah's vulnerabilities against her, pulling her deeper into his web. "She cried today," another entry read. "Said she felt trapped. Told her she was imagining it. She believed me. They always do." Emily's fingers curled into fists. The man she loved had exploited another woman, twisting her emotions for his gain. Emily turned to the most recent entries. The words became more erratic, the tone darker. Things she threatened to go to the police, said she'd ruin me. Her eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. I couldn't let her. She left me no choice. "It's done." Emily's hands flew to her mouth as a sob escaped. The words were clear. A confession. David had silenced Sarah. Her mind reeled, images of the cheerful young assistant flashing before her eyes. What did he do? Where is she now? The room spun as she closed the diary, her pulse roaring in her ears. Emily sank to the floor, clutching the diary to her chest. The weight of the revelations crushed her, leaving her gasping for air. How had she been so blind? The man she married, the one who promised to love and protect her, had destroyed someone else's life. He wound the staff around his waist and pulled loose from his belt. Tears streamed down her face as she hugged her knees, the darkness of the room pressing in around her. Ever so cautiously, the old woman reached forward, her hand groping in the darkness. "I trusted him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I trusted him. I never trusted him." The next morning, Emily sat at the kitchen table, the diary hidden in her lap. David's keys jingled as he entered the house, his smile as effortless as ever. "Morning," he said, placing a kiss on her head. The gesture felt hollow, a mockery of what they once shared. Emily's fingers tightened around the diary. Her mind screamed at her to confront him, to demand answers, but fear held her back. What if he denied everything? What if he did something to her? She forced a smile, her voice trembling. "Morning." David's gaze lingered on her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Some of this seems familiar. That afternoon, Emily met Lila in the park. The crisp autumn air did little to calm her nerves. She sat, parades, scurried around the dirt path toward the large house, trying to understand what was happening. "You need to hear this," Emily said, handing Lila the diary. Lila's eyes scanned the pages, her face growing pale. "Emily, this is serious. You need to go to the police." Emily shook her head. "I can't. What if he finds out? What if he—" Her voice broke. Lila grabbed her hands, her grip firm. You can't keep this to yourself. You're not safe. You need to protect yourself. That evening, David's behavior shifted. He lingered in the study, his eyes darting to the shelves more often than usual. At dinner, his questions became sharper. "What did you do today?" he asked, his tone casual but probing. "Just errands," Emily replied, her fork trembling in her hand. David leaned back, studying her. "You seem distracted." Emily forced a laugh. "Just tired." But the intensity in his gaze didn't waver. Late that night, Emily opened the diary again, desperate to make sense of her next steps. As she turned the pages, a folded piece of paper slipped out. Her breath hitched as she unfolded it. "I know you've been reading this. Be careful, Emily. Some secrets are better left buried." Her hands shook as she dropped the note, her heart pounding in her chest. He knew. The sound of footsteps in the hallway sent a chill down her spine. She slammed the diary shut, her mind racing. The door creaked open, and David's silhouette appeared. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice calm yet laced with something darker. Emily swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "No, just thinking." David smiled, but his eyes stayed cold. "Careful what you think about, Emily. It might lead you somewhere you don't want to go." As he left the room, Emily stared at the diary, her heart pounding like a drum. She knew one thing for certain. She was running out of time. As she looked around the living room, she spied 2 books stacked against the wall and saw a map. The soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminated the bedroom as Emily turned the last page of the diary, her hands trembling. She heard the faint creak of the floorboards, and her heart sank. David's voice shattered the silence. You've been busy tonight," he said from the doorway, his tone unnervingly calm. Emily's stomach twisted as she looked up. David leaned against the frame, his piercing gaze cutting through her like a blade. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice betraying her nerves. David stepped into the room, his movements slow, deliberate. "Don't play coy, Emily. You've been snooping. I can tell." Emily tried to steady her breathing, but his imposing presence only tightened the grip of fear around her chest. Emily stood, clutching the edge of the dresser for support. "I haven't touched anything of yours," she said, the tremor in her voice betraying her calm facade. David's lips curled into a faint smirk as he crossed the room. "Your hands say otherwise," he said, glancing pointedly at her trembling fingers. She shook her head. "I don't know what you're talking about." David moved closer, his expression hardening. "Don't insult my intelligence, Emily. I'm giving you a chance to come clean." Her mind raced for an escape, her thoughts tangled in a web of fear and confusion. "I swear," she stammered, I wouldn't." His eyes narrowed. "Lying doesn't suit you. Now tell me, what did you find?" Emily's panic boiled into defiance. "You're asking what I found?" she snapped, her voice rising. "How about the truth about Sarah?" David's jaw tightened, his cold demeanor briefly cracking. "Careful, Emily. You don't know what you're talking about." Her courage wavered, but she pushed forward. "I know you were having an affair, and I know what happened to her. The diary makes it pretty clear." David's silence was deafening. He took a step closer, and Emily instinctively stepped back. "You don't understand the situation," he said finally, his voice low and sharp. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." David let out a cold, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "So you think you've figured it all out, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Emily's stomach churned. "What did you do to her?" she demanded. He folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "Sarah was blackmailing me," he said simply. "She found out about some dealings at work. She wanted money. I gave her a little, but she got greedy." "Don't lie to me," Emily shouted, her voice cracking. David's smile widened, his eyes dark with malice. "Believe what you want. She's gone. That's all you need to know." "Fum fum fumse." David's words echoed in Emily's mind as fragments of the diary resurfaced. The meticulous notes, the manipulation, the chilling confessions. It all painted a far darker picture than his carefully crafted story. She realized with gut-wrenching clarity that Sarah's disappearance wasn't just about blackmail. David's actions had been deliberate, premeditated. Sarah Harrison's plot to raid the cabinet. Sarah Harrison's plot to kill David. Her pulse quickened as she grasped the gravity of the situation. She was trapped in a web of lies, and the man she thought she knew was at the center. Emily's hand slid behind her back, fingers fumbling for her phone on the dresser. She opened the voice recorder, praying the soft chime hadn't been audible. Elspeth frowned, her eyes falling to the worn-out phone screen. David's eyes bore into her as he continued. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for. But you need to stop playing detective. It's dangerous." "Dangerous?" Emily asked, forcing her voice to steady. "For who? Me? Or you?" David's smile faded. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" As he stepped closer, Emily's hand tightened around the phone. Her breaths were shallow, her heart pounding as she tried to keep the device hidden. David's gaze flicked to her hand, and his expression shifted. His calm demeanor shattered like glass. "What's in your hand, Emily?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. She froze, her mind racing for an explanation. "Give it to me," he demanded, his tone icy. Emily's hesitation was enough to confirm his suspicion. In an instant, he lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. "Recording me? Really?" he snarled, his grip tightening. "Do you think this will save you?" Emily yanked her arm free, the phone slipping from her grasp and skidding across the floor. Without thinking, Emily bolted. Her bare feet pounded against the hardwood floor as she raced toward the stairs. "Emily!" David roared, his footsteps thundering behind her. She reached the hallway, her breath ragged. Grabbing the banister, she propelled herself down the steps, the recorder still on the floor behind her. David's voice echoed through the house. "You can't run from this. You know what happens next." Terror gripped her as she darted toward the kitchen, searching for anything to defend herself. Emily's shaking hands fumbled with the bathroom lock as she slammed the door shut. She pressed her back against it, her body trembling. She pulled her phone from her pocket, dialing with frantic fingers. 911, what's your emergency? Her voice cracked as she whispered, "My husband. He's trying to hurt me. Please, send someone. Hurry." David's pounding on the door grew louder. "Emily," he called, his tone deceptively calm. "Open the door. Let's talk." Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the phone to her chest. The operator's voice reassured her help was on the way, but all she could hear was the sound of David's fists against the door, and her own heart pounding in her ears. The morning sun cast long shadows across the driveway as police cars pulled up to Emily's home. She stood frozen at the window, her heart pounding as officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp and commanding. David, seated at the kitchen table with his coffee, barely looked up as the doorbell rang. "Expecting someone?" he asked, his tone indifferent. Emily's voice trembled. "David, it's for you." He frowned. But when he opened the door and saw the officers, his face hardened. "David Ellis, you're under arrest," one officer announced, handcuffing him as another recited his rights. "This is a mistake," David protested, his voice sharp but failing to mask his fear. "Emily? Tell them." Emily didn't respond. She stood silently as his confident mask cracked, revealing the man beneath. At the station, Emily handed the diary to the lead detective. Its leather cover felt heavier than ever, as though it carried the weight of Sarah's story and countless others. "This," she said, her voice firm despite her shaking hands, "is everything you need." The detective flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with every line he read. "This isn't just about Sarah," he muttered. Emily nodded, her chest tightening. "I know. He hurt more people than just her." The diary, with its meticulous entries, painted a chilling portrait of David's manipulations and crimes. It became a damning piece of evidence, one that left no room for doubt. Over the following weeks, investigators uncovered a tangled web of deceit. David's crimes extended beyond Sarah blackmail. Planetary dyes planted by hand, and ruined lives littered his past like debris. Emily sat in on one of the briefings, her stomach turning as each revelation emerged. "Sarah was just the tip of the iceberg," one officer said grimly. "There's a trail of victims stretching back years." Emily clenched her fists under the table. She thought of the people David had left broken and betrayed, and guilt surged through her for not seeing the truth sooner. The courtroom was silent as Emily walked to the witness stand. She avoided David's piercing gaze, focusing instead on the judge's steady eyes. The prosecutor held up the diary. "This document is a record of manipulation, lies, and ultimately murder. Can you confirm its authenticity?" Emily nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, I found it in our home. It's his handwriting." David smirked from his seat, but Emily didn't waver. Her testimony was raw and emotional, laying bare the betrayal she had endured and the darkness she had uncovered. When the verdict came, guilty, relief washed over her. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. In no time, she realized, the days of individualism never really ended. Instead, the house was eerily quiet after David's arrest. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, her thoughts spiraling. Emily said, she saw Sarah's face in her mind, her bright smile, her kind eyes. Emily couldn't shake the thought, "I could have stopped this sooner." At night, the silence felt oppressive. She lay awake, haunted by memories of David's voice, his cold gaze, his chilling words. Guilt clung to her like a shadow, whispering that she had been complicit by not acting earlier. Desperation drove Emily to seek help. Her first therapy session felt like stepping into a storm. "I feel responsible," she confessed, her voice breaking. "If I had acted sooner, maybe Sarah would still be alive." Her therapist nodded gently. "You can't change the past, Emily, but you can learn to forgive yourself and move forward." Emily also joined a support group for survivors of emotional abuse. Sharing her story among others who understood her pain was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. Lila became Emily's lifeline. She visited almost daily, bringing coffee, distracting her with stories, and reminding her of her strength. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Lila took Emily's hand. "You survived something unimaginable," she said softly. "Don't let him take one more moment of your life." Emily's eyes welled with tears. "I don't think I could do this without you." "You don't have to," Lila replied firmly. "I'm here, always." Months later, Emily stood in front of a room of strangers, her palms sweaty, but her resolve steady. "Thank you for being here," she began, her voice trembling slightly. My name is Emily, and I'm a survivor of emotional abuse. She shared her story not to relive the pain, but to show others they could find their strength. After the meeting, a young woman approached her, tears in her eyes. "Your story gave me hope," she said. Emily smiled, her heart swelling with purpose. Her pain had transformed into something powerful, a beacon for others lost in the darkness. And for the first time in months, she felt free. The house was eerily still, every creak of the wooden floor amplified in the silence. Emily sat on the couch, the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. The emptiness of the room pressed on her like a weight. She glanced at the coffee table, where the diary sat closed, its worn cover a constant reminder of everything it held. Her fingers brushed its edge as memories surfaced. David's cold gaze, Sarah's bright smile, now gone forever. End of chapter 20. Recording by Pete Williams. Description by Jesse Lyford. Fantasy Griffith, French Emirati. "How did I not see it?" she whispered into the stillness, her voice cracking. The moments she'd brushed aside, the lies she'd accepted, they all came rushing back. First the whites, now the Pete. Emily's chest tightened as she stared at the diary. The thought gnawed at her. Was I part of this? Did my silence enable him? Her mind replayed the small, missed clues. The nights she'd ignored his absences. The way she'd dismissed her gut instincts. Tears rolled down her cheeks as the guilt settled deep within her. "I should have stopped him," she muttered, her voice heavy with regret. The weight of those words lingered in the air, pressing on her like an unbearable burden. Through her tears, a spark of resolve flickered. Emily wiped her face with trembling hands, her breath steadying. "I can't undo the past," she said aloud, the words firm. "But I can make sure no one else suffers because of him." Her thoughts turned to Sarah and the other victims. Their stories wouldn't end with tragedy. Emily's pain would have a purpose. Emily opened her own journal, its pages blank and inviting. She picked up her pen, her grip steady despite the storm raging within her. She began to write, her words flowing with conviction. The past haunts us, only if we let it. Moving forward doesn't erase the scars, but it gives us the chance to grow, since we refuse to undo this wrong. As she closed the book, she exhaled deeply. For the first time in months, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't an ending, it was a new beginning. One defined by courage, self-trust, and the promise of a life rebuilt.